Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Dan Glickman, the director of the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School. We want to welcome everybody here to the forum. Tonight's special guest speaker kicks off the International Career Fair, sponsored by the Kennedy School of Government's Career Services. For those of you that don't know the important details, the Career Fair will take place tomorrow from 9:30 to 2:30 on the 5th floor of Taubman. At the fair will be representatives of Unicef, along with 21 additional international employers. Both Carol Bellamy and I spent some time in politics. And perhaps if you had to say the phrase, the most constant refrain that you ever hear in politics is the following: we've got to do this for our children. Every politician running for president, every politician who's ever run for anything, always says we have to do it for our children. Unfortunately, the policies often do not follow the rhetoric. But that is not the case with our guest this evening. When she talks about doing something for the sake of children, you better start taking notes, because she means it. Often here at the Institute of Politics, and by the way, Carol was a fellow at the Institute of Politics. I won't say what year it was, but she reminded me today that while she was a fellow here, she was a victim, as well as others, of a burglary at the Institute. And so I hope she has fonder memories of the place than just that. But often people say here, how do I get involved in public service? Or how do I get involved in international development? Or how do I get involved in the more traditional politics of elective office? As I read our guest speaker's bio, I saw the answer. Her career path reads like a how-to manual for those wanting to leave the world a better place than they arrived. If it's government, the private sector, or an NGO, her path and journey is one worth studying and learning from. She earned her bachelor's degree from Gettysburg College. She then answered President Kennedy's call of service by volunteering for the Peace Corps for 2 years in Guatemala. She then earned her law degree from NYU. For those Harvard undergrads or Kennedy School students who feel running for local political office is beneath you, let me remind you that our guest speaker this evening started her political career in the New York State Senate. In 1978, her political skills were rewarded when she became the first woman elected president of the New York City Council. And I imagine that is real politics, the New York City Council. After her stint in local politics, she had a distinguished legal career, and then culminated as the managing director of the investment banking firm Bear Stearns from 1990 to 1993. She then served as director of the Peace Corps, becoming the first volunteer to become director. She then assumed the helm of UNICEF as executive director in 1995, where she has been ever since. Her leadership at UNICEF is legion, but it's focused on 5 basic priorities: immunization, getting all girls and boys into school, getting all schools to offer quality basic education, reducing the spread of HIV/AIDS, and introducing early childhood programs in every country that is served by the United Nations. In any event, it is an honor to have somebody of such distinguished background, a living honor, because this is somebody who lives her job every single day that she is working for the people of the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the Honorable Carol Bellamy.
Dan Glickman, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. A great Secretary of Agriculture. I think you have to understand that Secretary of Agriculture does many things in the United States, including, among others, be the key interactor with the World Food Program. So if we're talking about international development, it's certainly one of the very key agencies dealing with international development. So it's nice to be here. It is nice to be back at the Institute of Politics and at the Kennedy School. I was here so long ago. I was giving an interview with somebody, I think, with the Crimson today, and I told her I was a fellow in 1975, and I believe she was trying to figure out whether her mother was alive at that point in time. So it reminded me of my times at the Peace Corps when I told them I was a Peace Corps volunteer in 1963. It was like, let's see, was that before or after the Civil War? So it was so it is nice to be back. I was saying to people, just to put some of this in perspective, that everything in this entire Kennedy school complex, to the extent it even existed at one point in time, was stuffed into either that little yellow building on Mount Auburn Street, which I don't know whether it exists anymore, and Lit Tower. So you see what extraordinary things have happened over the last 25 years. So that's really quite wonderful. I'm also pleased to be here on the eve of this kickoff of the International Career Fair, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these issues, but I'm going to point out Rohini De Silva, who is our Deputy Director of Human Resources. She will be one of the people talking to tomorrow. I still think we always demand ridiculously narrow job descriptions, so keep reminding her, I think she's pretty attuned to this, that I always believe it should be X, Y, Z, and Q, or comparative experiences. And so if you can make the argument that they are similar experiences and they meet that, I think all of us in the UN should be more open to this than some of the really restricted language that we use in our job descriptions. It's also nice to be here seeing some of my friends. It's, you know, this is a place where we have an opportunity, even in the UN, to have some of our really terrific young, and I emphasize the young because I think if it gets to people my age or slightly below, you should say no, having us come here. But some young folks coming here, and I've met a couple folks who are with UNDP who are here right now. I've met somebody who was with the Chinese mission, and I'm delighted that Philippe Duhamel, who was a senior person, he's very young, but senior person in my office is also here, and it's nice to have him here. It's also nice to see some of my wonderful friends, Jock Heron and Julia Moore. Where are you guys? Oh, in the back. Sitting, yeah, right. They don't even sit on chairs. You know, when you get older, you have to sit on tables. So it's nice to see them. Julia, I understand you are, the coach or the assistant coach of the squash team. Good luck. What is squash? No, actually, no, that's great. I'm glad. You don't know. She is a one vicious tennis player, I will tell you. I'm also delighted. I've run into a number of you who are, I'm sorry, this is my bias, but who are returned Peace Corps volunteers. How many of you were in the Peace Corps? Are there a couple? Oh, I met some more than I even got to meet. I met Namibia and Kyrgyzstan. Where else? Where? Togo. Togo and Mauritania? You know what? This is the great thing about it. I figure Peace Corps volunteers who made it through Mauritania will make it through anything. Let me tell you, this is truly, I mean, and actually Peace Corps loved Mauritania. I am a zealot about Peace Corps. You will learn that from me. I'll probably mention it 400 times tonight. But it's the most extraordinary experience of my life. Doesn't mean that every day was wonderful. Oh, were there terrible days. But I really, truly believe that Peace Corps is still one of the really extraordinary experiences. And I mentioned this in the context of being here at the Kennedy School, being here in the context of the legacy of John F. Kennedy in terms of even though maybe his idealized figure might not be quite what we thought it was, nevertheless, in terms of his call to Americans to become involved in politics and public policy, at least for me and for many others, and I hope for many to come, the experience in the Peace Corps. And I don't limit it to the Peace Corps. I think that people who are prepared to say, look, let's go out and see what the world has to offer out there, and what can I learn from the world, and maybe I can make a small offering to the world. And that's what we did in Peace Corps. We made a small offering, and we got this extraordinarily large offering back to us. Was an extraordinary thing. So I have now looked. I noticed that the different advertisements for my being here tonight have ranged in various topics, none of which I wish to talk about tonight, but I will deal with them briefly. One topic was Millennium Development Goals, are they doable? Well, maybe and maybe not. How is that for? Anyone want to pass that off to Jeff Sachs? Just tell him. Bellamy was here and said, nah, maybe, maybe not. No, quite seriously, I think the Millennium Development Goals are crucial. And some of the things I'm going to actually share with you a little bit tonight, I think will influence whether they are doable or not. because I want to talk about since the career fair is coming up. I actually want to talk a little bit about the environment within which those of us involved in international development and humanitarian activities, I want to talk a little bit about that environment. I don't want to be negative. On the other hand, I want to be serious about the environment within which we are all working these days. Then I was, then another poster. God, this is like word processing. You never know which letter you've actually signed because they all look good, except they've all come off at different times. So another poster said I was going to be talking about changing the world with children. Frankly, I believe that's very important, not changing the world for children, but changing the world with children. I've had an opportunity in the last week, if I can say. I was thinking about two events. I spent an hour today with two fourth grade classes from the Brimmer and May School. Public school is not in session right now here in the Boston area, and since I was up, I went from doing radio interviews to Boston Globe editorial board to speaking at a kind of a big donor luncheon to going to fourth grade classes. That's what I do in my life. But actually, the clearest group that I met with today were the fourth grade classes. That's, of course, before this group here. Without question. And about 4 or 5 days ago, I was actually in Kenya and met with a group of young people there. And I've actually been just thinking that it really, I don't want to, I'm going to obviously sound like a UNICEF director, but listening to young people's voices is a very important thing to do. It doesn't mean following everything that young people's voices say to do, you should do, because their voices can be stupid sometimes. Their voices can be ill-informed sometimes. But listening to young people's voices is a very important thing to do. Young people's voices are honest, they are untarnished, they are not sophisticated, there's a clarity. I'll share with you, if I might, and maybe Dan's had the same experience. I used to love when I was actually an elected official, and this happened to be in New York, but to kind of speak to fourth and fifth and sixth graders, because I could learn more about what the adults in in the communities I represented were thinking than I could ever from speaking to the adults. Because the adults would give you the nuances of what they were thinking. And the children would just tell you straight out. So I was asked today, for example, do you think you've accomplished anything in your job? Have you changed your hobbies? I didn't have any to start with, but this is a really hard question. Do you miss your friends when you travel? I thought that was a very good question. I do. So, in any case, so my comment on the second title of one of these posters that they put out there about change the world with children is to emphasize the world with. It doesn't mean to do everything. It doesn't mean everything that young people say is the right thing. It doesn't mean to follow everything. But listen to the voices of young people. They actually are, they're quite clear. The clarity in young people's voices is quite extraordinary. The freshness and the honesty is quite extraordinary. And I offer that to you. Now, what I would like to talk, I have a couple things I want to talk about. I want to talk about public service, public service, and also existing in the private sector. I'm going to talk for a couple minutes, then I really want to do Q&A. I have been lucky enough in my life, or perhaps I can't hold a job, but I've spent half my life in the public sector and half in the private sector. I am by training, if there is training, a corporate lawyer. I did after Peace Corps, which is still the best thing I ever did. I went to law school at NYU, and then I practiced corporate law for almost about 4.5 years at a big, huge law firm in New York City. I learned an enormous amount. I do not, I love every moment I spent there, even though it was some of the most difficult times. And even today, young lawyers and young bankers and others are totally abused and misused and made to work ridiculous hours. But I learned an extraordinary amount. Then I spent 13 years in elective office, both as a New York State senator, and then as president of the city council, which is the number 2, which at that point, the government in New York has changed its structure since then, not because of that office, but was the number 2 office, but independently elected, not like a lieutenant governor who gets elected because you're the governor, but actually independently elected. So I was actually independently elected in the 7.5 million New Yorkers. I try and remind my good friend Gro Brundtland sometimes when she reminds me she was the prime minister of Norway. I say, well, that's really great, Gro. You were elected in 3 million people, and I was elected in 7.5 million people. And she says, yes, but I was prime minister. So one has to put that in perspective. And then if you've been number 2, of course, you want to be number 1. So I ran for mayor of New York in 1985 and came in number 2 again. So then I had to find a job. And so I thought about going back to law, and I didn't. And I actually, for the next 7 years, was an investment banker, first with Morgan Stanley and then with Bear Stearns. And then I actually turned it down the first time, but thank God they came back and asked me again. Oh, thank you, Lord. I was invited by the Clinton administration, by President Clinton, to become the director of the Peace Corps, and it was just such an extraordinary experience to come back to Peace Corps. My one claim to fame being that I actually was the first Peace Corps volunteer, having been a volunteer in 1963 to 1965 in Guatemala, to become the director of the Peace Corps. So I really had a bond with the Peace Corps volunteers. You know, amoebic dysentery is an extraordinary bond in development work, which is why after Peace Corps, I actually went to law school because I wanted to work for USAID, which in my mind was Peace Corps with flush toilets. But by the time I got out of law school, this is all too old for you, but my government was involved in this war that I didn't agree with, so I would show them, so I went to Wall Street. Which never quite made sense to me. In any case, from 1983 to 95, I was director of the U.S. Peace Corps, and that's where I was when the U.S. government was looking for somebody to recommend to be the director of UNICEF. Having been a New York politician, you would think you would not get hung out on the line to dry, but I didn't even know that much about the UN, even though I come from New York. If you come from New York, you understand you never go beyond 2nd Avenue. There are no restaurants. If you're a New Yorker, you go nowhere where there are no restaurants. Even though there's the UN, ugh, no restaurants, nothing to buy. So I didn't know that much about the UN, and I didn't realize, so when the US said, well, don't say this. Actually, Secretary Albright came up to me one night and said, I was at a thing. I was Peace Corps director. He said, how'd you like to be the director? How'd you like to be our candidate for UNICEF? I'm sorry. Ooh, I didn't remember anything other than trick or treat. But it sounded great. I said, whoa, yeah. She said, okay, great. But don't say anything because you're not really our candidate for UNICEF. We actually have a candidate. But if we need a woman, you could be our candidate for UNICEF. In essence. So then a couple of weeks later, I'm reading the newspaper, and at that point, Boutros-Boutros-Ghali, the Secretary General, wants a woman, and I go, oh, I guess I'm UNICEF. Then I find out that it's not so easy. It's not the U.S. who makes the appointment, it's the Secretary General, and the European countries very intelligently said, hey, this isn't some monopoly that the U.S. has. We want the next director of UNICEF. So I got really depressed. I just went back to playing squash. And then there was this terrible food fight between the Europeans and the Americans. I thought it was terrible. Oh, we should only know. We should go back to this as contrasted with what we have now. I think we had old and new Europe versus the United States at that point. In any case, ultimately, I was appointed. Here's my point. I want to argue with I want to suggest that we live in an extraordinary world today where people have an opportunity to do really serious things in both the private sector and the public sector. And I would hope that people would think about the potential for opportunities to do both. I realize there's still suspicion between both, and it really shocks me, but there is suspicion. Quite frankly, the private sector thinks that those of us who've been in the public sector are a little retarded. We're a little below caliber. They think we're well-meaning, They don't think we're bad. Yeah, a few of us are bad, but mostly the private sector thinks we in the public sector are well-meaning, but not quite up to really doing a real job. That being said, there are too many people in the public sector who think that everybody in the private sector is some vicious person, or doesn't care, who doesn't really want to make a difference, who are only there to make money, who really don't want to see the world a better world. I mean, there really is still, it's changing, but there's still too much suspicion between the two. I believe passionately that there's really a lot that the two can contribute to each other. Seriously, I'm not just talking about, oh, a little here, a little there. And I've met too many people who've been in the private sector who get on a public sector board and all of a sudden drop their kind of strategic thinking about what you should do. Or people who've been in the public sector who somehow get involved with the private sector and kind of still, a little worried. I mean, what does it mean? It doesn't, there are different motivations. And the last time I spoke here, I spoke about the UN dealing with the private sector. I do believe there are two different bases from which you come. And I do believe you have to maintain the principles that you subscribe to in the environment that you are in. But I really believe that experience in the public sector can contribute to you being a better private sector person. In fact, my view is if you find a really good public sector manager, they may be one of the best managers you'll find. Because a really good, and there are some bad ones, but a really good manager in the public sector has to manage, I think, and sometimes in a more difficult environment than a manager in the private sector. But I also believe that there are some real skills in terms of performance and measurement that you can learn in the private sector that can help you in the public sector. So I know you're all thinking about different careers in the future. I think you should follow your dream, your vision. I wouldn't urge you to do anything than what you believe, but I really think that the opportunities exist today, globally, actually. I mean, it's probably been a little bit more in the U.S. than it's been in the rest of the world, but I think it's breaking through in the rest of the world for people to have an opportunity to spend time in both the public and the private sector. So look for different kinds of, look for opportunities where you can bring your skills to bear. And think about that. Think broadly in those kinds of things. So that would be one message. I just offer that as a message since you're about to head into to tomorrow's International Career Fair. Now, I'd like to talk momentarily about UNICEF, but not so about UNICEF. I would like to talk about the environment within which development and humanitarian assistance exists today, because I think it is an ever-changing environment, and I see it changing even in the 8 years I've been at UNICEF. So to share some challenges, but I think we have to be realistic about these challenges today. I think we have to move away from this kind of a huge divide between doing development and doing humanitarian work. I don't mean it's all exactly the same, but I think that the work that we are engaged in today, we have to see as having competency and skills that are usable in ever-changing environments. Because that's what's happening. The only constant in the world today is change. And the extent to which we have historically in development, it seems to me, operated on, it seems to me only North Korea, Cuba, and development agencies still plan on 5-year programs that never change. Now, I think we have to plan long term, but I think we have to build a flexibility because the world is constantly changing. There is more instability in the world today. What is that instability brought about by? Well, it continues to be brought about by poverty. Poverty continues to be a drag on the system, and a poverty that exists in the face of, even with the burst in the economic bubble, a poverty that exists in the face of the fact that there has been economic growth in the world today, and broader economic growth, but still an extraordinarily deep poverty with extraordinary disparities in society. And we have got to confront these disparities. It doesn't mean that everybody will be on the same level, but we have got to dig through, we've got to drill down and deal with these disparities. But I want to go beyond poverty as just the issue that affects the ability to engage in effective humanitarian development activities today. And I want to take on some other issues that are not new, but they are new. I want to take on HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS isn't a health issue. HIV/AIDS is a societal functioning issue. And it has to be seen in that respect. If we continue to see it as a health issue, if it continues to be parked in a health ministry, if we continue to deal with it as a sectoral issue, then it will be business as usual. And this pandemic, which I believe, and I know you're going to hear from Peter Piazza, he will be far more vocal and far more intelligent than I, but I believe that the pandemic of HIV/AIDS has the potential for destabilizing the globe and is already destabilizing portions of sub-Saharan Africa. HIV/AIDS is not, however, just an African issue. It is a global issue. Yes, the countries most deeply affected at this point in time, and so affecting the work of any of us in development or humanitarian or international diplomacy or anything international, HIV/AIDS has hit most harshly in sub-Saharan Africa with prevalence rates of 25 and 30 and in some regions and areas 40%, so that it is virtually undercutting the capacity of governments and society to function. Yes, it's creating orphans, people are dying, but it is virtually eating societies and challenging the virtual existence of some societies into the future. But it exists everywhere. Last year, it doubled in numbers, not huge numbers, but doubled in Russia and Ukraine. The second most heavily, broadly affected region is Latin America and the Caribbean. The second most highly infected in terms of pure numbers is Asia. And yet in the north, where we are, while it still exists, either A, those who are infected have the capacity to be treated, or it's increasingly affecting people in marginalized communities, minority communities. And so the urgency in the north is not great, while the urgency in the south, in my view, this is dynamite, and it is truly challenging the potential of the functioning of society. So I believe this is something that all of us, we don't have to be AIDS workers, but all of us have to confront in terms of moving forward. Third, poverty, AIDS. Third, instability, largely because of conflict, and I want to argue the increasing nature, the nature of the changing element of war. It didn't just change yesterday. But if you look in the 20th century, at least midway through the 20th century, war was still largely between nations and largely fought by military units. The end of the 20th century into the 21st century, war today is largely within countries and fought by multiple parties. And the victims are increasingly not military, they are civilian. And those victims are victims, if not directly, they're victims by displacement, they're victims by deterioration of the functioning of systems. It's like a conflict guinea worm. It just eats inside of you. And it is having enormous impact. And that instability, again, largely by conflict, but just instability. Venezuela is not conflict, but it's an instability where the schools aren't functioning, kids aren't going to school. But these are the environments within which we are working today. That creates for the engagers in development and humanitarian assistance more insecure environments within which you are working. It's less safe out there. It used to be that if you were providing assistance, no matter who you were, the Red Cross, UNICEF, Save the Children, you were off limit. Now, potentially, you are targets. I'm not trying to scare you off. I'm trying to create a sense of the environment that we are working in today. That being said, I believe that there's never been a time when, and I'm about to stop and hopefully take some questions, I hope. I don't think there's ever been a time when work in development work in international development, in international humanitarian investment was needed and needed more than ever. But we have to think about it now not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of, I hate these words. Ooh, I was just about to say it. Capacity building, blah, 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 UN speak. But really, capacity building, supporting people, helping people ultimately to help themselves, not helping them forever holding their hands, but creating an environment where we add value. Not what we do, but what we do that makes a difference. Not how many trainings we have, but did any of those trainings make a difference? Not how many workshops, not how many publications, not how many meetings, not how many staff, but the challenge for those of us who are interested in international development and humanitarian experience is whether what we are doing makes any difference. So I'm going to close now, and I'm going to actually read something, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to read from a speech that to me I return to often to remind myself. It's actually a speech, since we're standing in the Kennedy Center, but it was actually a speech that Bobby Kennedy gave in South Africa in the 60s. And he talked about, and I'm not going to go through all this, but I am going to read a bit. He talked about discrimination. At that point, he was talking about apartheid also. He talked about people starving. He talked about violence. He talked about people, intellectuals in jail. He talked about wealth being languished on armaments. He talked about the same things that exist today. And then he said, these are differing evils, but they are the common works of man. They reflect the imperfection of human justice, the inadequacy of human compassion, the defectiveness of our sensibility toward the sufferings of our fellows. They mark the limit of our ability to use knowledge for the well-being of others. And therefore, they call upon common qualities of conscience and of indignation, a shared determination to wipe away the unnecessary sufferings of our fellow human beings at home and around the world. Our answer is the world's hope. And this is my challenge to you. Those are my words. I come back to him. It is to rely on youth. Not a time of life, but a state of mind. A temper of the will, a quality of the imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for the adventure over the love of ease. Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. And in the total of all those acts will be written the history of this generation. I challenge you to help write the history of this generation. I thank you very much for inviting me here tonight.
I've done this about 20 times, and I think that's the longest applause yet. So that's a pretty good sign, Carol.
It's a job fair tomorrow.
Yeah, right. We will go around the audience, and I ask you to please keep your remarks brief. Please ask a question, and the shorter the question, the more likely the jobs will come. I promise you that. And state your name and, if possible, where you are at the university. So we'll start right here.
My name is Leanna Marr. I'm with the Graduate School of Education and former APCD in Peace Corps Guinea. And I'd like to ask, given what you talked about with the current state of conflict around the world and really the havoc that's wreaking on educational systems, what work UNICEF is doing in the area of emergency education.
Did I ask you to ask me that? Anyway, Guinea is a perfect example. I mean, there's a country where, while it itself has not really been at war, it's just taken the burden of so many refugees from so many of the countries in West Africa, Liberia and Sierra Leone and others. Well, I'm passionate about lots of things. I'm passionate about education in emergencies. And for too many, some of you, if you've dealt in development, you know that the donors have little boxes. They're very good. I love the donors, love every donor, but the donors have boxes. And, you know, the box of emergency, you can have pills in emergencies, but education has always been in this nice little box called development. Well, when does that come? I mean, when does development come in Sudan after 30 years, or Somalia, or Colombia, or other places? And I think the good news, I hope, is slowly but surely, some of the donors, because they're out there, are realizing how important, and some of us are really pushing this, it is to try and keep some degree of learning. Maybe it's not a formal school, but some degree of learning going during the worst of crises. Because if you don't do that, because these crises go on so long, whether it's Liberia or Guinea or other places, that you'll lose whole generations of kids who will never get educated because the crisis go on too long till you get to emergencies. So, till you get to peace. So, we in UNICEF, with others, I mean, again, lots of NGOs, Save the Children, Plan, Care, others, we're very active in this area. We have something called School in a Box. Now, so typical UN. At one point in UNICEF, we named it EduKit. Ugh. And our education people, if they're education, or you're an education person, they said, oh, well, you have to call it EduKit because blah, 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 blah. I said, nobody understands what it is. Call it School in a Box. So, show you what power I have in UNICEF. One of the few things I was able to do is change it back from EduKit to School in a Box. But it is, you know, it's a big box, and it contains kind of materials that you can set up some kind of a learning environment no matter where. Displaced persons camp, earthquake, wherever, refugee, out in the middle of nowhere. It's not the school, but it has the pads, the pencils, the thing, the little, make your pencil right, whatever that thing is. But real things, teaching materials for the teachers, chalk. And we really are using this a lot. We use it enormously in Afghanistan, for example, to try and get schools going again. 7,000 tons of materials. 1.5 million kids came to school on the first day of school, March 22nd, 2002. By the end of this year, 4 million kids were in school. We're using it now we're pre-positioning it in Iraq, I should tell you. We've used it in lots of countries. It really is an opportunity, and not just in war, in countries where we've used it in Ethiopia, God, where was the place? I'm trying to remember that. I remember visiting a place where we were doing therapeutic feeding in one tent, but in fact, the mothers would come with all their children, and in fact, not all the children needed therapeutic feeding. So the way we could make sure that the kids who were in the worst shape got the therapeutic feeding is that in the next tent, there was kind of some schooling going on, and we were able to support it through the School in the Box and the materials and helping and trying to identify the teachers. So for us, some kind of learning. It doesn't have to be a formal school, but some kind of learning going on even in the midst of the worst emergency is critically important to try and bring a little normality into this abnormal situation. So very high priority, and again, I don't want to say it's only UNICEF.
See, right up there. It's hard to see. Yeah, you right there.
Hi, my name is Danielle, and I'm a freshman at the college. My question was actually regarding the polio vaccine initiative in Iraq and how that will work in concert with possible war in Iraq.
Polio. 1988 at the World Health Assembly with WHO, there was a decision to engage in a campaign to wipe out polio. In 1988, there were over 120 countries that still had polio. I know we don't think about it in this country, but it still existed. By 1999, there were 33 countries. By the year 2000, there were 20 countries. By the year 2002, there were 10 countries. Now there are fewer than 10. But while we have to keep fighting polio in these fewer than 10, there are a couple of countries that are not entirely certified free yet, even though they haven't had polio for a couple of years. So there are fewer than 10 where polio existed last year. There are countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, India. There's been a little setback in India. A couple of Nigeria, Egypt, which shouldn't be one of them. A couple other countries. Now, Iraq is a country where there has not been polio since 1999, but there was an outbreak of polio in 1999. So we have just, with WHO and other Red Cross, we are on February 27th starting a 1 week with 14,000 volunteers health volunteers around Iraq. There will be a polio campaign to try and do a identification of any child who has not gotten the 2 drops on the tongue. That's why you can have all these workers. I can do polio vaccine. It doesn't require, any idiot can. It doesn't require, that's why I can do it. It doesn't require a jab. It's 2 drops on the tongue. So this was regularly planned. It was always planned. This is the timing for it, and we're trying to do it because we need virtually another year with no cases in Iraq. That being said, the other thing we did is we've speeded up the measles campaign. So the polio campaign is going ahead as it was planned a year ago. We have programs in Iraq, UNICEF, World Food. The measles campaign actually is a little bit more related to the potential of a war than the polio campaign. Polio campaign going ahead the regular time. Measles campaign was to come a little later, but our concern is, should there be, and we hope there will not be a war, we have sped up a campaign to try and identify we're looking at 4 million kids in terms of polio. We're looking at 500,000 kids under 5 who did not get covered in the last measles campaign in Iraq, because our concern is if there is something that happens in Iraq and if there's movement of people, one of the things that happens, that can happen in large movements of people is a breakout of disease, and measles is one of the things that can break out, and you actually die from measles. So in answer to your question, polio was already planned, but vis-a-vis war, the measles campaign is being speeded up. Finally, just to say that, as I said before, the people that suffer the most in wars these days are civilians, largely women and children.
Gentleman right there.
Yes, hi, Carol. I was at Gettysburg for a while you were there, so I was just curious, what was your major at Gettysburg? If you dare.
This is not the Battle of Gettysburg.
I was, oh my God, this is 59 to 63. Now you can see. I was a psych major. I decided I wanted to go to social work school. I applied to graduate school in social work. I was actually accepted to graduate. Those are the days. Now, you women won't understand this, but in those days, really dark ages. A woman could become, if she stayed in school, she could become a social worker, a nurse, a teacher, or a librarian. Really, it was virtually limited to that. So I was going to become a social worker. Then I got locked one night in the library, and I came across a pamphlet for the Peace Corps. And I applied for the Peace Corps. A little story on the Peace Corps. First of all, those were early Peace Corps, so they took anybody, really, truly, totally unqualified people. That was me. And then you had to take a language exam. I was terrible in languages. I had no idea. I'd taken like 1 semester in French. So I took the language exam in French, although they said you won't fail if you fail the test. Well, I didn't fail the test, but it was clear I didn't do well. They assigned me to a Spanish-speaking country. Secondly, if you were at all qualified in those days at all, they assigned you to teach, largely in Africa. They assigned me to be a community developer in Latin America, which means we have no idea what you're going to do, but go out there and do it. So that's
Anyhow, my question, interestingly enough, was about the Peace Corps, what I wanted to offer to you. And that is, as I've tried to contemplate how we can really think globally, in reality. And that's through the Peace Corps, to get some incentives. So young people are thinking about going into the Peace Corps in the same numbers as go into the military, and have the same basic incentives in terms of education, everything else, benefits in Peace Corps, so that we can begin to renew ourselves as a global citizen and as basically goodwill through the Peace Corps. If we were serving countries in need, the poverty, everything else, as well as health and environment, we could really turn this around. But I am terrified of the image that we are creating, and I see our salvation as a country as the Peace Corps.
Well, now that I've told you I am passionate about the Peace Corps, can I tell you something? I also think we live in a world today where you don't have to become a Peace Corps volunteer. I think we live in an environment where young people, wherever they are, and again, at this point, I know there are a lot of folks from other countries here, but I want to argue about Americans learning more about the rest of the world. I believe because of technology, we live in a world where young people can learn much more about the rest of the world than they were ever able to in the past. And I just think I hope parents will take opportunities to talk to their kids, to help them learn a little bit more about the rest of the world. I believe this in every country, but particularly in this country. I mean, the kids go on the web, they go on everything. They know, oh God, can they do stuff? And it's a great opportunity for them to learn more. So while I certainly would encourage people to do Peace Corps, I just think for Americans there's a much greater opportunity, for everyone, but particularly Americans, because I think we've been kind of in this box. I think there's a much greater opportunity for kids today to learn about the rest of the world than there ever was before, and I wish that folks would try and figure out ways to encourage that.
This gentleman right here.
Yeah, given the fact, my name is Kelly Fujiyoshi, I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School. Given the fact that you're kicking off the career fair tomorrow, what do you believe to be the most important knowledge, skills, and abilities for people interested in pursuing careers in international development and humanitarian activities?
Flexibility. None of which, and tell you the truth, the only thing that's never written in the job description is flexibility. But seriously, I don't mean all over the place, oh, anything goes, da-da-da-da. That's not what I'm talking about. But I do think the ability to respond to a changing environment is a critical component in being able to work in development and humanitarian work. I believe the willingness to take on slightly different challenges. I really do. I mean, I think one of the problems we're still too vertical, and the health professional, and we want people who are professional in their fields. I'm sorry, we want the professional health and the professional nutrition and the professional technology and the professional finance. But I do believe we've been a little too narrow in this area, and people who are willing to try other kinds of experiences, I think, are very important kinds of qualities that we are looking for. I actually believe language is very important. I don't mean every language, and again, this is something that we Americans are horrific on. We just yell at people louder in English. And English, I realize, is a base language, so I do think English is very important to have, because most of the development documents, no matter what entity, UN, NGO, or whatever, so for those of you, if English isn't the primary language, it is important to have English, but I do think for those of us where English is the primary language, if we have at least one other language, it forces us at least to be sensitive to how, whatever language it is, it forces us to be sensitive to communication more than not having that other language. But I would start first with flexibility.
This gentleman right here.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jason. I'm from the School of Education. My question was basically related to AIDS again. And you were talking just now in answering Liana about the box that donor governments and agencies have. And the AIDS box right now seems to have antiretroviral drugs on it. And Bush has just put $5 billion that Clinton also endorsed, I guess, this week. The Kennedy School signed a petition for antiretroviral drugs. And I just wanted to get a sense of what you thought the role should be in the response to HIV/AIDS, if we should be putting a lot of money or not so much money into antiretroviral drugs.
I think it needs to be a mixture. I mean, our work is largely focused on prevention of mother to child, which includes antiretroviral. In fact, we are actually now, because of that, the largest within the UN purchaser of antiretrovirals, but it's the nevirapine that we're purchasing. But in UNICEF, we've largely been focused on prevention of mother, on prevention among young people, and on orphans. And there's been this battle between, should it be prevention or care? I actually believe it should be both. So I think there should be an important component that is treatment and care, which includes antiretrovirals. On the other hand, I don't think that is the only answer. And in fact, I think some of the, I think some of the super emphasis on antiretrovirals comes again from the North, where that is really the answer these days. But what we really have to do in the South, not to ignore prevention, not to ignore care, and that's the problem. There's been this fight between prevention and care. I really think that care has to be part of what we're doing. But in the long run, the interventions for prevention have to be just very key. So I would only see, I don't know what the percentage is, but no more than half, if not maybe slightly less than half, of the AIDS funding going for care. That being said, some of it has to go for care, and some of it has to go for real care, which is antiretrovirals. My fear is, on AIDS, is a couple things. One, with the creation of the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, very important, is that's going to give a sense that the issue of funding for AIDS is taken care of, and it isn't taken care of. First of all, it was created to entirely bypass the UN, probably for a reason. Maybe we weren't doing our job, not just UNICEF, but others. But the fact is, on the ground, UN and NGOs are on the ground, and the governments are looking to us. So if those entities aren't functioning on the ground, you don't have some support for the governments. So you need some funding to go to direct on-the-ground type of stuff. Secondly, this global fund, it has, in my view, also forgotten pretty much malaria and tuberculosis, so it's particularly not helpful for malaria and tuberculosis. And then finally, quite frankly, I don't think we are seeing additionality into the global fund. I think we are seeing the same money that people announce over and over again, whether it's the US and others, largely, into this global fund for ATM. The fact is, business as usual on HIV/AIDS, no matter how good you think it is now, business as usual will lose the fight. Really, we'll lose the fight. Unless there is, and first and foremost, it has to start with governments. So it isn't even the external community. It has to start with governments itself. But unless there is a dramatically ratcheted up response to HIV in the world, money, other kind of activity, then huge parts of the world are going to be affected. So my answer again, some should go for ARVs, but it is only part of the answer.
Let's go over here, this lady.
Hi, my name is Joan Krimlisk. I was a student at Radcliffe Seminars years ago. And I was wondering, with so much an increased access to the internet, if UNICEF has any programs working with children in many countries in their languages, and whether software or hardware companies are helpful in that sense.
We have Voices for Youth, which is trying to use the internet. I think we could be doing more than that. I also think we have to be thinking about some of the negative uses of the internet, but not reject the internet because of the negative uses. But I do think we have to keep in mind some of the negative uses. I don't think we've worked well enough so far with the software companies.
Gentleman right there.
Good evening. My name is Ricky Choi. I'm from the School of Public Health. I've heard a lot of concern from NGOs in that the drafting of A World Fit for Children, that UNICEF has departed from using human rights language. I was wondering if you could speak to this concern and the role that the Convention on the Rights of the Child and Children's Rights will be to guide UNICEF goals.
I'm not sure I understood your question. That you think it was too weak?
That it didn't use human rights language, that it created its own top 10 list instead of really binding itself closer to the CRC.
Well, first of all, the CRC is in place, thank God, because there were some attempts to roll some of it back. Remember, for those, any of you historians here, the World Summit for Children that UNICEF backed in 1990, while it was held at the United Nations, was actually, and it had all the trappings of the UN, was actually not a UN meeting. It was a Jim Grant construct, wonderfully brilliant, my brilliant predecessor. It was an extraordinary meeting. The special session on children, ultimately held in May of 2002, was an official General Assembly meeting. And while UNICEF supported it, and we were the secretariat and we tried our best, this was a negotiated document among governments. I think ultimately the final document is actually a pretty good document, given that it's a negotiated document. So you're talking about 190 governments all having to agree on language. So if you can say it with 10 words or 100, you say it with 100. I prefer they say it with 10. So you say all children, comma, including, I kept saying, what does all mean? So it is negotiated language. I don't think it, by any means, it rolls back anything from the convention. The convention is in place. I would have liked to have seen some of the language a little stronger. It rolls back none of the language on reproductive health. It didn't roll it forward either, but it was never going to. So I think what we need to do in this environment within which we are living these days is, quite frankly, I will tell you, a strategy of ours at UNICEF, is not throw out agreements already reached for negotiation anew. Because if you've already reached certain limits, let's keep those, because we're in an environment where there are some pressures to roll things back. So don't be afraid to advocate for what's been already agreed, but don't put them out there for renegotiation, because it could roll them back. But I'm quite satisfied about the rights-based approach of the outcome document from the special
We're
session.
going to only have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take this lady and this lady right up here. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Akiko Mitsui from the Harvard Business School. You alluded to several of the influences of the UN on UNICEF in terms of appointing the managers or the culture of the UNICEF. And my question is, in light of the current rhetoric about the relevancy or irrelevancy or the conflicts within the UN, how dependent is UNICEF on the UN on 3 dimensions: in funding, in your programs, or in your organization itself?
We get no funding from the UN directly. We have to go out and raise our own funding. We're part of what's called voluntarily funded. We're not the only one, UNDP, UNFPA, World Food. So we have to go out every year and raise our funding. We get although we're a little different than some of the other agencies, we get 2/3 of our funding from governments, very important. But we actually raise over $300 million a year from private sources. Not all private corporate sources. It's everything from people who buy our cards to people who buy our ties, which are not nearly as good as the Save the Children ties, but getting better.
Send me a tie.
Right, I'll send you a tie. They're getting better. To people who put change in the envelopes, to people who do the checkout for children, to actual fundraising. We do an enormous amount of direct mail in Japan, for example. So we're a little different because we don't get all of our money from governments, but we get the UN does not write a check. And in fact, I mentioned before this increasing greater security problems in the UN. The UN agencies have had to put more money into security because the UN general budget will not put more money into security, which I believe is an appalling fact, which they know, I think. You had a second part of the question, which I forget.
She asked about other things, organization, personnel.
Oh, what other ways? The UN doesn't come down on our head on personnel as such. I have to keep in mind we're a UN agency, so we need a balance, but we are not as subject as the UN generally to absolute percentages of people. But we're a UN agency, so we need to have a balance. The major impact, I suppose, would be there's been an excessive amount of activity around UN reform, most of it good, some of it a little too process-oriented, and it really needs to become more program-based than process-oriented.
This lady right there.
My name is Roseanne. I'm an MPA student and also a corporate lawyer. And I was wondering if you could build on your comments earlier about partnerships and tell us what qualities UNICEF looks for in a global partner and what some of the benefits have been and what some of the pitfalls have been in your experience.
We have all different kinds of partners. We have NGO partners. We could not carry out our work, particularly in emergencies, without NGO partners. Whether it's working with a Médecins Sans Frontières, or what's the Irish one? I'm trying to. There's several Irish ones. Concern, for example, that's an example. It doesn't mean the Irish one. In supplementary feeding programs, or whether it's working with Save the Children in family reunification, whether it's working with Oxfam in water. I mean, I've only named a few, and if I forgot your favorite one, I didn't mean to, because we couldn't do our work without those partnerships. We're increasingly now working in partnerships with a number of other places. We really think that the faith community, particularly, and parliamentarians have a very major role to play in AIDS orphans, in helping to build support in community institutions. On the corporate side, we have historically only seen the corporate side as money. Okay, that's an element. I want us to see the corporate side, not every corporate, I mean, we have to look, but and we have some guidelines, and everything from landmine manufacturers we won't work with, and child labor is an issue, and manufacturers of formula, baby formula that don't comply with the code is another issue. But I want us to also look at our corporate engagements, partly on money, but partly on technical expertise in some cases. I mean, distribution capacities of a company that can reach many places in terms of how we get our HIV/AIDS messages out. Looking at, hygiene campaigns. I mean, hygiene campaigns, in my view, working with companies that produce soap, as long as we're not recommending their soap, but we're working together on a hygiene campaign. If it turns out at the end of that hygiene campaign, more people buy soap, and it turns out some of the soap is the soap company that we work with, so be it, as long as our posters on hygiene didn't say buy XYZ soap. In other words, I think on nutrition, on fortified foods, on working with pharmaceutical companies, on expanding access to immunization. I'm just using some examples. So I do think we still look to the corporate and the private sector in terms of funding, but I want us to increasingly look for not so much intellectual partnerships, but technical partnerships in the corporate sector. I still think we're working our way through this. It's a little sticky in some cases, but I think it's expanding.
Well,
Sorry.
I know that Carol has to catch a plane back to New York, but I think she is an example of a type of person that we all would want to aspire to, and that is that she sees herself as somebody who can change the world. I'm always reminded that the Talmud says if you save one life, you save the entire world, and I think Carol Bellamy does that every day of the year. So thank you, Carol, very much for coming. It was different than most things. I liked it. It was, it was fine. All right, I'll be up there. All right. Why don't you guys...